My name is Mark Hahn, and I am Director of Cloud Strategies and DevOps for Cyber Global. We're a US-based consultancy, and we develop software for lots of different clients in many different areas. But so I'll be hosting today, and I'll let our panelists begin to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Raul. Raul, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm the CEO at DevFactory. And DevFactory has a portfolio called DevGraph that Max just spoke about. DevFactory is also the core R&D org for a larger group called ESW Capital, where we are a group of 140. We are in the business of acquiring companies. We have over 140 enterprise software companies in our portfolio, and we manage about 600 million lines of code. And a little bit of background, we moved to a remote work environment where we had remote development centers back in 2000. And in 2008, we decided to go completely virtual and global. So since 2008, we've been completely remote, virtual, global, with thousands of developers spread across 120 different countries.
Great, thank you, Raul. And now, Raza, I'd like you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Raza Syed. I am head of engineering for Agile and Security Services at Microsoft. I run a global organization which is spread across time zones and regions. We have engineers in India, in Ireland, and Puerto Rico, and obviously in Redmond. So we have been in remote environment since before the pandemic. And since the pandemic has started, pretty much we are in a virtual remote mode. So in some ways, we had the traditional remote model with a headquarter and then other development centers around the world. And now we are in a total virtual mode. So thank you for inviting and looking forward to sharing our best practices and experience.
Great, thank you, Raza. And next, I'd like to ask Bill Page to introduce himself. Bill, please.
Hey, Mark, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Yes, so I'm with EY, or Ernst & Young, we're also known as. We've been doing remote teams for a number of years, and I've been in the thick of it. So it started back in 2006 when we opened a shared service center doing a lot of our processing and reporting in Bangalore, India, to service the US. Well, now all of our global offices are using shared services. In addition to that, I'd say as a retention tool early on to maintain some of our workers who needed to be home more often than in the office. And I guess, thinking about the young mothers and others with personal situations, we started having a remote working for local as well as the shared service. And now with the pandemic, pretty much everyone is working remotely. And I also have experience in all the different combinations. I know we'll probably get into it today, but you have, of course, your shared service. You have some of the team in the office and maybe one or two that are not. You have a couple different offices that are remote from each other. So I have a lot of experience on how to manage and make those effective, but there's different scenarios within the remote working kind of dynamic. So happy to talk about those or anything else that comes up today.
Great. Well, we'll have a bunch of questions around that. And last, PJ, if you would please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thanks, Mark, and hello, everyone. PJ Singh here in sunny California, San Francisco, California, United States. I'm a VP of technology in a large bank here in the United States. And my current team is, spread across all time zones, about 30 different locations here in the US, as well as we have a large overseas team in 4 different cities in India. I've been working with remote teams all of my 20 plus years in my career. I've also had teams that have been nearshoring in Canada as well as Argentina. And with this current pandemic, of course, all of us have been remote. I have myself worked remotely for about 10 years in one of my previous companies. So I'm very happy to share any insights that I can on this virtual world that we are faced with right now.
Great, thank you very much. So I appreciate all of you have got a lot of experience in working with remote teams. So before we just dig into a lot of the nuts and bolts, let's figure out, what are the different types of remote teams that we deal with. So Raul, I'd like you to describe the various flavors of remote working that we've run across in the, in the far past and the recent past. So pre-COVID and during COVID.
Yeah, I think in the late 90s or early 2000s, we kind of evolved to offshore a bunch of work, and that's kind of how the remote kind of system really started. So just having offshore offices, which originally started as a cost-cutting measure, introduced the concept of remote. But over a period of time, that has evolved into a bunch of different flavors. You've got remote, you've got where you have remote offices, you've got virtual, which is kind of a flavor where people are attached to a local office that they go into, but they are part of the time kind of working virtually. So it's kind of hybrid in the sense that people are part-time, they spend some time in the office, some time at home. There's completely virtual where everyone in the org is in a different geography, and the geography doesn't really matter. They are spread across time zones. There are also time zone specific, remote, where there are companies that try to remain remote, but within a band of time zones, which makes it convenient to have overlaps of time for members of their team. So I think there are a bunch of flavors, and just like a lot of dev practices, they've kind of all evolved organically to fit the needs of different orgs. But broadly, I'd say there's remote, there's virtual, there's hybrid, and then there's the time zone centric remote that kind of fits the overall pattern.
Yeah, right. So, PJ, does that sound like the way that you guys are working, those rough categories?
I think Rahul covered pretty much all of them in broad categories. One of the things that has, with the evolution of Agile squads and Agile teams, one of the things that we have seen that makes it effective is co-location. And that co-location itself has been, we evolved differently. And one of the methods that Rahul just described, which is time zone specific, now we call team members who are in the same time zone as pretty much co-located and not necessarily who are in the same office. So yeah, I agree with all the various flavors that Rahul described. I think that a few more mutations of those flavors are pretty much developing in the way that we will see in the near term.
Okay, yeah. So we've kind of changed the definition of what our term co-located means. So, Raza, you've been working with, you went from largely an on-premise organization to one that's working remotely and working virtually. So what are some of the challenges that you find in managing remote teams and particularly with development teams? What challenges have cropped up that you need to solve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I said, have always been in remote mode, but the way we are doing remote has significantly changed. But largely the challenges, I would put them in 5 categories. So first challenge you will always hear is with remote team that you have to significantly enhance your communication patterns within the organization. Because when you are remote, teams are in different time zones, especially, it's critical that you are becoming more structured, sharing the information more. But I would talk about one specific dimension which is important for that, especially the teams which are not in fully virtual mode. And that's what I call information inequality. So typically, if you are, and as we are going back to offices, what you'll notice is some folks will notice, especially in an organization which has headquarters and different remote sites, is that folks in remote sites feel that they're not getting the information at the same level. While no one in an organization knows everything, but remote folks, the remote regions are at a special disadvantage. So it's very critical you recognize this communication and information inequality and challenges there, and make sure that leadership is empathetic to that and taking steps to make sure that they're supporting different modes of communication and doing the practices there of looping folks in and making sure you're building that trust. The second part challenge, which is related but slightly different and especially critical for engineering teams, is building a rapport. So any engineering team which is creating, effectively when you are in a software organization, you're generating an IP, intellectual property, and it's critical that you have a great rapport relationship between individuals within your team so that they can do their best work. I often say that writing software is a team sport. So building that social connection in a virtual mode is a different ball game. And it's extremely critical when tight timelines come in, when challenges come in, because small miscommunication cause big issues. Again, making sure that the teams are working in a mode that you have virtual morale events. And one thing that is critical here is establishing good norms for virtual meetings. And for example, I'll mention one thing is having the cameras turned on for virtual meeting, trying to have an eye contact with each other makes a huge deal. Most conferencing products today allow you to have a group view to see everyone, and that makes a huge difference. You know, that connection, rapport with each other. Um, and I'll quickly go through three more things. One is time zones, already talked about. Be cognizant that even since we are going in all virtual mode, time zones are a specific challenge, and time zones can be converted into a strength differences. For example, teams which are in a life site support mode, they can follow what we call follow the sun model. Means you can be on call during daytime of your region, and that way a global service can get a global support. So make sure that you are cognizant of time zones and that handling those challenges the correct way. It can be a strength, but it can also become a very challenging thing. And the second thing, additional thing I'll call it is the leadership style. The leadership style for global teams, you have to take into account all the things I mentioned so far. And one of the key principles as a leaders, your leadership has to make sure that they are in the mindset that every team is in a different time zone, and we are willing to make sacrifices, all of us equally with equity. And if that culture you build as a leadership, you will have a very effective remote team. So that's kind of the overall, I would say, challenges you face. The last challenge I'll mention, and folks who are in remote team will say, it's a very important one to address, which is the growth concerns. So everybody wants to grow in their career, wants to get to the next step in the career ladder, and so on and so forth. So what you have to make sure that you are setting a culture in your organization that being remote doesn't hamper your career velocity. And that's critical, because when people know that being in a remote location, they can avail all the opportunities, rise up, and so on and so forth. That's when really you get a really motivated and inspired team. So those are the 5 challenges, 5 areas where you need to focus on and effectively running remote engineering organization.
Thank you. Thank you. Bill, you said EY has been remote for a very long time. How do you govern that? What processes and governance do you have in place to make that work smoothly? You've got about a decade worth of experience in this,
Yep.
So maybe you could share some of those processes with us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would encourage that it start at the top. So if you have, let's take the scenario of you have a team that is providing a service and they're offshore, and then you have the buyers of that team being what we may call onshore, that the leaders on both ends are first talking what are the expectations. We heard the term follow the sun. That might be one. There might be some work that doesn't need to be simultaneous. There is some work that will need to be simultaneous. So that needs to be agreed upon, and who can handle what. As far as local teams going on there, usually that will happen if it's one person, kind of an exception model where they would work remote. It would be understood between the manager of that person, and they would explain on down to the group and the person, him or herself, that is participating, and that's kind of laid out up front. It's very important that everybody understands what is expected of each team. Are you expected to jump on at midnight because you're in a different time zone? Is that only an emergency? Is somebody on call? All these things need to be worked out. And so from a governance perspective, starting at the top, that the top people on either side of it have agreed, and then they filter on down to the teams and make that communication work on down. And then for those that it doesn't work, it might not be the right situation, what you're proposing. And they're going to differ depending on what you're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. PJ, you mentioned that you've changed some terminology about what co-location means. What other things were in person before that you discovered that COVID you can now do remotely? So where did you find some places where remote actually kind of worked for you?
That's a great question, and that's one of the biggest insight that we've had. We were forced to go through, and we had that insight recently within our organization. So any Agile organization, whether whichever framework you use to scale your Agile organization, SAFe or less, or whatever framework you use, one of the quarterly events usually that happens is what is called as big room planning or PI planning. That's like a 2 or 3 day event in which, in my organization at least, almost 300 people sort of get together. Our business partners are the senior leaders. All of us get together to hash out our plan for the next quarter or next program increment is what we call. And we thought that since we have eliminated all other travel, this is one travel which is really required. And we used to have this big event where people would travel from all the various locations in there, and we would have large meeting rooms booked where we could accommodate like close to 200, 300 people. And of course, that couldn't happen because of COVID, and we had to do that remote. And that is one thing that we did not think could happen remotely. We have been doing that for a few years, and we always invested in that to have that interaction time, face-to-face interaction time. And we have had to do that remotely. And that was a big insight that we got, that no, we can actually do it effectively, even remotely, given the right tools, given the right mindset, and given the right engagement from various groups. We can still have it done across multiple sites and do it effectively remotely. And so for the last year and a quarter, so that's close to 5 of our big group plannings or PI plannings, we have had it done remotely, and it was pretty effective.
Good. That's great. So does anybody else have any similar experiences along those lines, things you've discovered that you can do remotely that you didn't think you could do before?
So I just add a little bit to what Raza and Bill both said earlier, where in our experience, you can pretty much do everything remotely. And the key challenges there, if I add a couple of things to what both Raza and Bill said, I think fundamentally the management style has to change, and there are a bunch of disciplines that need to come in for work to be effective. And that discipline covers everything from communication, where we don't realize it, but when you're in a team, in a room, or in an office together, a lot of the expectations of what each one is supposed to do, each individual is supposed to do, is gathered off the other person in either casual conversation or through the interactions or non-formal methods of communication. When you go completely virtual or remote, you basically have to be very, very cognizant about the fact that you'll be very articulate in communicating what your expectation of each person is, what you expect them to go do, making sure that you don't have the information inequality that Raza mentioned earlier, making sure that we have a perception about how much someone works, for example, based on how we see them in the office. And now when people are virtual, managers feel insecure about whether they're, or traditional managers feel insecure about whether the employees are working or not. You have to change your management style to realize that if you are very clear in your communication, in your expectations, then everything can work, but managers have to change. And for individuals, at the same time, There is the factor of discipline that has to come in terms of how you dedicate your time to work. Create blocks of 1 or 2 hours each, and do 4 such blocks in a day. Schedule your time where you have focus. Create a space for yourself within your home or wherever, where you can kind of create a parallel work environment and not get distracted by other stuff around you. There are disciplines that have to be brought in, the focused work and all of those things that also fall in on the individual. So there is a big change in style that encompasses communication, infrastructure as well, where you need to make sure that you have the right infrastructure and the right tools to be able to do all of this stuff remotely and effectively. There is management styles and especially decision making. Decision making is one of those things that make or break teams as they move to virtual. Making sure that everyone feels not disenfranchised when it comes to decision making is really important. It becomes even, as people start going back to offices, as things start normalizing over the next few months, hopefully, you'll start realizing that people who continue to remain virtual will feel like decisions are being made in the office, and they are missing out on that decision making by staying at home. So I think that decision making has to become more async via more written communication rather than the off, conversations that you have in the hallways or in the office.
Yeah,
that is. Go ahead, Raza.
I'll add a couple of points to Rahul. First of all, there are quite a few things that personally myself, I'm surprised we are doing now remotely that effectively. I would say, and it might be common for some organizations like Rahul's, but for us has been a big change. For example, we have hired people completely online for the first time. Nobody has met them physically, let's put it this way. They have started, and some of them are college hires. And now we have finished 1 year with them, all online. So it's pretty amazing. It seems kind of becoming a normal now for us. But if you had asked me that's how we are going to be in a fully virtual mode, it's pretty impressive what we have done. That's one example. And I think Rahul made some great points. I would add to that in this manner that that as we are basically we learned that to make these decision making and actually all the way from code reviews to running the live services. We were running in remote mode before, but our remote teams were also in different sites and locations. But when you go and everybody's working from home, that adds completely different dimension. There are lots of distractions at home. It's maybe a special scenario right now with kids staying with their parents. So again, now you have to focus on making sure there is flexibility in your processes and allowing people to adjust around those things. And what we're finding is once your processes adapt to provide that flexibility, now truly the potential that whole virtual environment, virtual teams provide you is completely immense. You can get to the talent from around the globe and have it part of your team, and then you can effectively run those things. It's pretty phenomenal, but the primary thing, as I said, you have your leadership style has to adjust, your infrastructure has to change, and in some ways, some of your core processes have to change as well.
Interesting.
And I'll
PJ?
pick on the management style that Rahul was referencing to as well, because there is a huge shift in general, regardless of whether we're going virtual or not, in the management style that is required for a modern day organization in general. But it has become much more critical with the advent of virtual teams, which is moved from this command and control management style to more like empower and encourage. And the reason why I say that it is more important is because one of the foundation of how you can have a command and control organization is through monitoring, and that is like really much more difficult when your organization is virtual. And so you're like forced naturally to go into more of an empower and encourage management style and leadership style into your organization as we go more and more virtual. And that sort of brings us out of the old rust that traditional organizations have been in, and get into a more, to be able to have an organization where the management style or the leadership style is empower and encourage. You're gonna have to make the right hires, and that you don't have to monitor, in general. So it has a number of ripple effects in general, but that is one aspect of the leadership style that I think has been changing across the board naturally, but has just been accelerated so much because we now have to manage virtual teams.
Yeah, PJ, it's Bill. I think it's a great point. And I think what we're moving towards, not just in the remote and virtual world, but in a lot of business in general, other than straight service, I think you're looking at a production measurement rather than an hour measurement. If you think about some things that you buy, maybe someone to landscape your yard, you don't really care how long it takes them to do that. You want your yard landscaped and you're going to pay for that. And I think it's the same way with our teams when they're virtual. You're expecting a certain amount done. There was an earlier point about what are some advantages of virtual. What I've found is, it's a give and take. So you might need to pick up your daughter at school, but maybe later on tonight, you can go finish something up that we learned about later in the day. And if you're doing that from home, it's a lot easier to say, hey, to your home life, give me 20 minutes to go put this slide together. Where when you were in the office, that would have been very difficult. Would you have to drive back to the office to do it? So there's an advantage of, it's really it's a mixture of your own time and work time when you're working remote. And that can be very favorable for you as a business person or a leader, is that people can be available. Somebody will be available if you need something at night. And you just trade off by not a lot's going on during the day. They could take care of something personal during the day. But I really think that whole environment and what's shaping out of it is we're looking more at a production measurement versus an hours worked measurement.
Interesting. I think that's really great. So there's a question in the chat about Agile methodologies and how well Agile methodologies adapt to being remote work. And so I know that a number of the teams here, Raul, you mentioned Agile, Microsoft is Agile. How have your Agile processes adapted to being remote? And have they had to, or was it the case that Agile methodologies were already sort of a natural fit for working in a remote and hybrid remote organization?
So in our experience, so we do have a flavor of Agile that we run, but it's slightly tweaked to suit our virtual teams and our products and the kind of development that we do. That said, I think Agile is very conducive or actually very well suited to this completely virtual development mode because it hinges on a stand-up that lasts about 15 to 20 minutes and no more. And you want to make sure that is one place that everyone kind of needs to just sync up on. You need a 15-minute overlap for everyone in the org to kind of get together. But beyond that, as long as you are very disciplined about your communication and you can make it work in an async manner, Agile can actually work brilliantly. Like everyone else has said before, number one, you can leverage talent that's global, not remote or local to a geography. Number two, you can actually have work that's getting done literally 24/7 by virtue of the fact that your team is all distributed anywhere they like, and you can make use of that overlap. And as long as you have the right tools to allow for that async handovers and those communications, Agile actually works really, really well. And actually, Agile works better than when everyone is, in an office together and you have that one slot where you have to make everything work.
Right.
It forces you to go do your own thing, do the stand-up and then go do your own thing. Be the individual contributor or whatever, get your work done, then bring it all back. It's actually, it enforces a certain discipline automatically. So I think Agile is very, very well suited for this work.
Yeah, I'll offer a slightly different perspective. We've been managing, Agile organizations across two, very large, financial services companies over here. Initially, or the traditional Agile is not in no way traditional right now, but in the traditional Agile organization, actually it was thought that the best way that the squads or Agile teams or Scrum teams can operate is by being co-located, being in the same office, and that's how the offices were set up, as well as pods in which you put an entire team, and they should be able to rub shoulders with one another and see over each other's desk, each other's shoulders and solve problems. That was the traditional way of doing it. We have been forced to operate differently. I think the key to managing and co-location and face-to-face interactions have its value for sure. There's no question about that. The key is to understand what in a face-to-face interaction actually creates that value, and that's the collaboration. And if we can create that collaboration and opportunities of close communication within a virtual team, then we can keep the values that an Agile organization brings, even with a remote team. And that's where we have tried to. I mentioned that I've tried to rename co-located teams, not by people being in the same pod, but being in the same time zone, so that they have the greatest overlap possible. They're able to communicate with one another, closely and we have to create a culture of collaboration and close communication, provide the tools where that can happen. And if that can happen, then yes, the Agile teams can operate effectively as well. The key is how closely within a squad they're able to collaborate and they're able to how frequently they're able to communicate. That's really the key, not really being in the same physical location.
Great, thank you. Drew asked the question, what types of production measurements do you actually use? So before, I guess, before you were virtual, a lot of it was line of sight. If somebody looked productive, then you felt that they were productive. What types of measurements now apply when you're virtual? How do you measure that teams are productive or individuals are productive? Bill, I'm going to toss that to you if you don't mind to think about that.
Yeah, so what we would do is we'll come up with a service level agreement, SLA for short. And this is more on the groups of people that are in the processing side, a shared, offshoring. We would put down that for our customers, let's say you submit a payable, we would say that's going to be turned around in 2 business days or whatever it's going to be. And they would need to make sure that they are keeping up with that service level agreement. If the remote side said, hey, the volume is too great, we would have a discussion whether they need more resource there. If the complexity becomes too much that service level agreement is not correct, then we'd have to maybe revisit the service level agreement or exactly what we're expecting from that team, or maybe a little more on the front end going over there. So that's what we would do in the processing, where you have more vanilla type activities going on. When you have actual remote team members where they are contributing, I'm going to go back to my last comment. It's more on production and what are you expecting out of that team member? And I don't, it gets too squishy to have an SLA in that regard, but I think that should be considered in all, however you're using a remote team, is would you have an SLA where there's an agreement, we're going to do X by Y time? Or are you saying that we are going to participate and here's the expectations around participation and production? So it's going to change up based on what dynamic you're talking about with remote teams. But we've been doing this for a number of years, and I can tell you that it works really well. And communication is very easy these days with Microsoft Teams and Zoom and cell phones and texting and all the different ways you have to get a hold of somebody. And people are very conditioned to say, yep, I can do that, or that's going to be a challenge. Let's talk about why and what are the alternatives. That's just natural these days. When we were starting out, it certainly was an issue. Hey, what do we expect? How do we know they're not goofing off? Can they do more than they're doing? But I think it comes down to an agreement in a service level. What do we expect from you? Why? By when? Do you need more people? Do you have too many people? And so on. And then it just kind of iterates itself over time.
Yeah, I'll add to Bill's perspective. So maybe since I'm in software industry, I'd say it's actually one of the most debated topic is how to measure developer productivity. It was a hot topic before, whether remote teams, whether you are remote or not remote. And I think some of the things Bill mentioned are exactly right on, focusing on outcomes versus, effort, and also focusing on, there are metrics like SLO, service level objectives, and, things like how many security issues you have, how many bugs you have, so on and so forth. They're team level metrics. Then we have those for developers, we have metrics like pull requests, how many check-ins you're doing, what's your, how effective you are in making those changes without causing issues, how reliable your service is, how basically what are your latency numbers, so on and so forth. The good news from our perspective was whether you are remote or whether you are in person, a lot of those metrics still apply. And so from my point of view, I'd say is that once you implement the remote model or culture effectively, the difference between if someone is remote or not remote will diminish, and so as the metrics. And the culture you end up building is, if a developer, whether they are coming to the office or they're remote, if they are generating, their metrics are the same or better in some cases, or they can be judged just like any other physically present employee. So that's kind of like my perspective on this thing. And as I said about other things, to get to a point where a remote developer or remote engineer has the same opportunities to make the impact as the physical one, you have to make quite a few changes in your team. But once you do that, from a developer productivity perspective, I don't see a huge difference.
And what I'll add is that, again, as Bill and Reza said, developing our outcomes or knowing what outcomes the team is trying to get to is really important. And so we can represent that as SLAs or SLOs, or we can represent as OKRs or objectives and key results, and measure the team's productivity. When it comes to individual productivity or developers' productivity, or whoever's working, I think that's where it gets a little tricky, especially if you are in the remote environment. What I feel is that very quickly the method of this yearly appraisal or semi-annual appraisals and yearly reviews, that's getting more and more outdated with time. That is less and less effective. What instead is more effective is actually working in small teams. When you work in small teams and underperformance doesn't, the number one, the accountability becomes peer-to-peer within small teams, and underperformance is not hidden. In large projects of 100 people, those underperformance gets left under the carpet. Whereas over here, the peer-to-peer productivity accountability sort of forces the underperformance to rise up automatically. And so there is a natural tendency of self-selecting within the team that it does, and it can very well happen if we are working effectively virtually as well. And so, what my perspective would be that, for our teams, for managing teams' performance, yes, absolutely develop your SLAs, SLOs, OKRs. For individual performance, create a culture of working in small teams and, help the teams be accountable to specific team outcomes rather than focusing too much on monitoring an individual's performance directly like we had to in a traditional organization.
Yeah, we have a slightly different view to this, where I think there are two orders of problems. The first order problem is that traditionally, when you were in an office space, most managers were taught to, embrace the notion of the team, and everything was the team. And so all of the communication was things like, hey, we need to accomplish X, Y, Z, and then the team kind of took responsibility. with proximity within the office, you took cues from each other and figured out how to make that all work. In such scenarios, you would also have certain folks who would basically hide under or hide behind other people's performances, and those would get, hidden from common view, and managers created this perception of who was productive and who was not based on completely random factors like how long they spent in the office. That said, back to my comment about management style. Once you start not doing that and you start creating individual accountability where you say, okay, we need to accomplish X, Y, Z. I want person A to do X, I want person B to do Y, I want person C to do Z, and then you basically agree on it. You write it down formally. Okay. A typical example in an agile world is you create all your stuff, on a Kanban board or whatever. You go create, all of your tasks in one list, and then you let people assign tasks to themselves. The minute you do that, you basically don't have that accountability. Then you're counting at the end of the time, end of the week or end of 2 weeks or end of your sprint as to how much got done, right? But instead, if you take a very deliberate approach where you say, okay, at the beginning of the week, person A is going to do ABC, person B is going to do, the next 3 items and whatever. You plan it out where you have individual accountability from the get-go. You suddenly find that everything starts falling into place because people know what they need to go deliver. And you can measure productivity in terms of what gets done. It's just a different management style, but you're more deliberate about measuring what is getting done. And that's the first order of fixes. Once you got that down completely, then you can start talking about higher order metrics. Can you break down your work into more standard units that you can measure, right? And those are much harder things to do. But to start with, I think across most organizations that are making a recent move to virtual, just making sure that your communication is deliberate, has individual accountability, and you are not doing things that are generically mentioned across a team, I think that makes like 80%, it'll get you 80% of the way. Instead of having to worry about metrics right at the get-go.
Interesting. Very interesting. I think that makes some great points there, Raul. Let's go in a different direction for a moment. So, Raza, you mentioned a little earlier about having gone through a hiring cycle that's been completely virtual. How do you nurture new talent and ensure collaboration? How do you bring those employees into the fold and make sure that they're picking up sort of on the themes and the mission of a particular organization?
And great question. And we are learning as we are doing it. Let's put it this way. And you hit the nail right on the head. Small things like just onboarding someone virtually in a different region and a different country is something that we have to think about. For example, we had remote teams, but they were in specific regions. But now we are open to hiring even in countries where we don't have regional development centers. So starting from basic things as to how do you set them up, how to get them the right equipment, how to get them the right access to the source code, and being able to, how do you bring them up to speed with the various development standards in your team, as well as the mission and vision. And that's the thing that we have improved. I feel like over the year, we were literally a lot of these things we hadn't thought completely through as we did that. But as the time has passed, we have created more collateral, and that's what we needed to do. Things that were supposedly obvious for anyone joining the organization. Now we are making sure they're happening. You have to really group people with their mentors / peers, depending upon which career stage they are starting in, so that they can spend quality time with those folk. And then as we've talked about communication a lot, we have increased the opportunities for one-on-one with managers, as well as with the various team meetings, so that they can hear more about it. I think that those are all the right steps. But one thing I would say it's critical that you have them, give them opportunity to engage so that it doesn't become only a one-sided communication where you're talking. So give them opportunity to as they learn, at 60-day point, 90-day point, share what they have learned. We do these events, which is like tech, we call them tech talks, basically, and we do it once every week, basically. Originally, we used to do them on Fridays. Now we do them on Mondays, but where everybody can come in a very informal, easy go mode and demonstrate what they have written. It could be a very simple thing, a piece of code, or it could be something more complex. But encouraging those new hires coming in, participating in those, and being, you have to establish the culture where they're comfortable getting feedback, and also providing feedback goes a long way. But one thing I'd say, there is another question in the chat about social interactions and when can we do, how can we get to the same level where a lunch conversation or hallway conversations, you have the same impact virtually. The short answer is that we are learning as we are doing these things, and we're getting better at it, but it's still work in progress.
Bill, you've been at this for a while. How do you bring people into the culture of the organization and support those hallway conversations that physically everybody cherishes, but virtually we have to find a substitute for?
Yep. No, that's a great point. I wanted to bring that up earlier. Part of making this work is you have to have that feeling of belonging, that you're not just sitting behind a computer at a desk remotely from everybody else. So the way to do that is our culture at EY has always been, and even more so we're pushing on it now, is you got to start everything off in a casual, the traditional, hey, how was your weekend? Or I heard your daughter's doing this. You got to remember those are people over there. They're your team members. They have a other life besides work. And to just talk about that casually, be encouraging, offer help when you can for something outside of the project you're focused on. And you really got to make a point of it. And I find that's best right in the beginning of the conversations for people to do that. Sometimes you're urgent, you got a deliverable and you got to jump right into it. So you maybe apologize that, hey, I'm sure everybody's got a lot going on, but we got to jump right into this because of our time constraints. But if that's not the case, and most of the time it is not, to have a little bit of just an airy kind of personal conversation. And then, people will tend to ping each other during chats. It might even be a personal thing, and don't discourage that. There might be the old school boss style of, hey, you focus on the business here. But I think the more you have when you're remote, you give the people the ability to talk about something other than the topic at hand and talk about something personal that's going on or some great movie they saw or whatever it is, and encourage that, and everybody weigh in. And somebody who's not speaking, who doesn't normally speak during that little prep time, whoever's the more senior probably should ask them directly, hey, how was yours, weekend, or did you see that movie or anything interesting? Bring them in. So you guys probably heard the acronym D&I, diversity and inclusiveness. Our firm is firmly behind that. And that is, especially in a global organization and remote working, you have so many different types of people, so many different backgrounds, so many different thought processes. By drawing out the diversity of thought that you have, and I'm not just talking about racially or age or anything like that, it's just everybody's different, and to make them comfortable to bring what they have to the table. And that starts with that opening comfortability, making you feel like you're part of the team, and that you're valued, what you have to say is valued, and you will get so much better performance. And really, this is not just for remote, that would be anything, but in remote, it's just very important to have that time, let people talk a little bit of personal of what's going on with them, keep it airy and open, a little joke here or there, something funny is always great. I might call it, keep it entertaining. We had a virtual Christmas party, my team, and we asked everybody to bring with them to the party, and if they could get a screenshot of their first car, their first job, and their first concert. And then people would search out online and show the car. Mine was a 71 Duster. So I actually found one online. I showed the car. This was my first car. And people would talk about it and what was their first job and what they had to do. And it really helped towards building a team and getting to know one another. And we were never together in person. It was all remote.
So what other techniques have people tried?
So we have a slightly different approach to things. Number one is what we've learned is that, thousands of developers completely virtual. It's a fine balance between being respectful of people's time. Like when you're in a meeting with 10 people, you really want to use the 10 minutes or the 20 minutes or 30 minutes that you set very productively, because you don't want to waste people's time, especially when they have other things to go do as well. So it's a fine balance. So the approach that we take, there are two approaches. Number one is almost all managers or senior managers within the org do something called a coffee morning. So for example, I run a coffee morning 3 days a week. It's a half-an-hour slot where anyone is welcome to come join in. It's like hallway talk. We reserve that slot specifically for general conversation, 3 days a week. Okay, it's a 30-minute slot, allows us to talk about just anything about the business, anything about personal stuff, vacations, hobbies, photography, whatever. So people just come in and talk about, in my group, there are a bunch of people who come in just to talk about tech and, all the new stuff that they read about or learned about. So that we find is a focused way to kind of channel that social interaction where people who have the time, who have the energy, whatever, do that. Sometimes people request other time slots during the day. We accommodate that. But that allows us to be respectful of people's time when we are dealing with business, because there are people in 120 countries, and almost none of our teams have two people in the same geography. So when you deal with something like that, you want to make sure that the time that you use in face-to-face meetings, rather, when I say face-to-face, it's over Zoom or whatever, is used productively. The second thing that we found incredibly valuable is a tool called Sokoko, which basically gives us virtual presence. So we have models of our virtual offices where people actually show up in rooms. If two people are talking, we know that they're talking to each other. That feeling of presence, where you want to see whether somebody's in the office, the fact that they are in the office, the fact that two people are talking to each other in a room and you don't want to disturb them when they're actually talking. Things like that are incredibly, they're incredibly valuable in building that social fabric around work, which we missed when we didn't have a tool like Sokoko. So things like that really help, build that culture. So we have breakout rooms where people go in, and the minute you go into a breakout room, you get a video chat that has everybody in that breakout room. So there are things like that that help us bridge the gap.
What besides virtual conferencing and some of the chat tools that we've already been using prior to COVID, what are some of the tools that have merged out? I know, Raza, I'll kick this to you first because Microsoft has recently announced something called Mesh that tries to get at this. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? And we're closing in on the hour here, so we'll try to wrap up with this question.
Yeah, I think it's a great segue into what Rahul said, and actually Microsoft Mesh kind of highlights that too. If you think about to really be effective in a virtual environment, tools like Teams and Zoom are great, and just turning on video makes a huge difference. But the presence concept, the three other things I'd say, as we are doing more virtual meetings, there are three other aspects which are becoming critical for effective meetings. One is presence, and Rahul mentioned that just having with things like eye contact and engagement, that's great. The second thing is experiencing things together. That's the second part of it. How do you collaborate together? We have tools like whiteboard and most of these things. You can write code together, but we need to turn the dial on that. And the third thing is connect from anywhere. When we have meetings, someone may have sophisticated setups such as with a HoloLens, and then there might be someone on a computer without any HoloLens, and then someone might be on a phone. So how do you create immersive experience, engaging experience across all these form factors? And there are, what I expect is these new set of tools that are coming. Microsoft has announced one, as you mentioned, Microsoft Mesh. Check it out. It's pretty cool. But that's where the next generation tech is coming. We'll see other tech coming in, cameras improving, tools improving, and that will allow us, but in essence, do those three things better, which I mentioned as the presence part, the experiencing together and connecting piece.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we've got just 2 minutes left here. So Max, do you have any closing thoughts, or should we call it here?
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Amazing. Definitely a very insightful discussion. I can see we've had a ton of questions and a lot of engagement from our audience. So yeah, I'm sure anyone who has a question that wasn't answered or just wanted to discuss a bit more, I'm sure you can hunt down our speakers on LinkedIn. We've also recorded the session, so you can take a look back. That'll get sent out to you guys tomorrow. And please share to any colleagues you think it'd be relevant to. And yeah, massive thanks to our speakers. I know you're all super busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insight. Finally, thanks to DevGraph who made it possible. If you guys haven't heard of DevGraph, then be sure to check out their software. And yeah, finally, thanks for everyone for tuning in. Amazing. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.